Hurdle. Here I am. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this 2019 edition of the Edinburgh International Book Festival. My name's Nick Barley. It's my honour to be the director of this festival, and welcome to this, the first event in the programme for adults in the New York Times main theatre. We're so proud to have New York Times as our partners this year, not just because they're helping us to talk about the festival around the world, but because the values of the New York Times are so similar to our values: open-mindedness and the urge for public discourse, but at a time when the world needs that discourse so much. And who better then to introduce our programme for this year, We Need New Stories, than Tim Winton, one of the great Australian novelists, one of the world's great living novelists. If you don't yet know his writing, you need to. You will. And who better to interview him than John Williams, who's the daily books editor of the New York Times. And both of them, I think, are going to talk not just about Tim's new novel, The Shepherd's Hut, but about his work and about his life and about his ideas about Australia and the landscape and the world. Inspiration and imagination are part of what makes these writers so powerful when they come to the book festival. But the writers also need to be inspired by you. And Edinburgh's audiences, I'm sure you'll agree, are very good at that, are very good at inspiring the writers who come here. That's why the festival is so popular around the world with writers. And so I hope you will join me in this WWF-sponsored event in inspiring these authors by giving a huge Edinburgh Book Festival welcome to Tim Winton.
Thanks, Nick. Appreciate it. What do you guys think? Hi, everybody. From the sound of that, you probably don't need this introduction, but it's not every day you get to introduce Tim Winton, so you're going to have to bear with me. I just prepared a few remarks, and then Tim's going to read, and then we'll talk for a bit. Thanks for coming out on this first full day of the Edinburgh International Book Festival. I'm John Williams, as Nick mentioned, an editor and writer at the New York Times. It's my great privilege to be speaking with Tim Winton today, one of the most accomplished and acclaimed writers in the world today. We'll be discussing his latest novel, The Shepherd's Hut, and other topics. Tim Winton has won Australia's top literary honor, the Miles Franklin Award, 4 times. He first won the prize in 1984 for his novel Shallows and has won it since for Cloudstreet, Dirt Music, and Breath. His books have been translated into 28 languages, and he's twice been shortlisted for the Booker Prize. He's the author of a dozen novels, a half-dozen collections of short stories, and several books of nonfiction. He's authored a few plays, some books for children, and increasingly he's adapted his own work for the movies. Reading Winton is a great joy, but thinking about his output can be a bummer. He's the type of writer who makes you feel, no matter what you do for a living or for pleasure, deeply unproductive. Winton was born and still lives in Western Australia, which is a bit like saying Faulkner lived in Mississippi and Dickens lived in London. His work owns the place and defines it for many readers who may never even visit but feel they've been there through his eyes. They feature men and women down on their luck, running out of luck, desperately courting luck, and getting flatly rejected by luck. And every so often, for powerful if fleeting moments, feeling lucky. The men in particular are hardened by a life of physical toil. In his novel Breath, which, to say it too briefly, is a novel about surfing, the narrator says this about watching men out on the ocean: how strange it was to see men do something beautiful, something pointless and elegant, as though nobody saw or cared. And on the same page, he thinks, there wasn't much room for beauty in the lives of our men. Yet Winton's characters are constantly faced with beauty, most often the awe-inspiring kind of the natural world, but also the beauty of their fellow humans, whom they crave and console, and anger and alienate in turn. In Winton's work, there's a remarkably fine-tuned balance between an almost religious sense of wonder and an overwhelming perspective of our individual smallness on the Earth's stage. As one line in Cloudstreet goes, it suddenly felt like everything was possible and none of it mattered a damn. His novels depict a landscape both austere and lush, uplifting and terrifying. His beautiful memoir, Island Home, is a love letter to the bounty of Australia, but also a note of urgent warning about it. The New York Times described it as a call to arms that is at once distinctively local and painfully global. Much of this might sound grim, but as you know if you've read him, which I assume from the applause all of you have, It's rendered in such dazzling, stylish prose and shot through with so much wisdom and warmth that you're mostly just glad reading it that Winton is here to document the world, human and otherwise, as he sees it. He's also funny. His snappy dialogue can leave you smiling for pages. Almost done, I promise. His characters are often lonely, but they usually have at least a person or two, if not more, in their life and orbit. And for a stretch, at the beginning of his latest novel, The Shepherd's Hut, I thought he might be trying something starker, a pure man versus nature story, as 15-year-old Jaxie Clacton sets off on foot after the death of his father to meet up with his cousin Lee, who lives 250 miles away. He's on foot. He walks across Western Australia's wheat belt, an arid stretch where, as Winton writes early in the novel, wanderers stick out like a rat on a birthday cake. But before long, Jaxie comes upon the hut of the title and meets an Irish priest, Fintan McGillis, who's living there in the proverbial middle of nowhere. Fintan has been in hiding for 8 years for reasons he never fully divulges to Jaxie. The story of their relationship, mostly bickering with an obvious undercurrent of tenderness, builds to a conclusion that is among the most vivid and emotionally devastating of Winton's career. I have many questions I'd like to ask Tim, so without any further delay, I'm going to ask him to read a few pages from the novel, and then he and I will talk for a bit, and of course we'll have time for questions from you before we're done. So please welcome again, Tim Winton.
Well, it's going to sound pretty ordinary after that introduction. This is just prose, really. Anyway, this is my little feral 15-year-old Jaxie. When I hit the bitumen and get that smooth grey rumble going under me, everything's hell different. Like I'm in a fresh new world, all slick and flat and easy. Even with the engine working up a howl and the wind flogging in the window, the sounds are real soft and pillowy. Civilised, I mean, like you're still on the earth, but you don't hardly notice it anymore. And that's hectic. You'd think I never got in a car before. But when you've hoofed it like a dirty goat all these weeks and months, when you've had the stony, slow, prickle-up hard country right in your face that long, it's bloody sudden. Some crazy shit, I tell you, brings on this angel feeling, like you're just one arrow of light. And bugger me, here I am, hitting 100 already, and still not even in top gear. On squishy upholstery with one of them piney tree things jiggling off the mirror. I'm flying, and just sitting on my ass to do it. Off the ground, out of the dirt. And I'm no kind of beast anymore. So what does that make me? Someone you won't see coming, that's what. Someone you can't hardly imagine. Say I hit your number, called you up. You'd wonder, what the fuck, every one of yous? And your mouth would go dry. Maybe you're some stranger I pocket dialed, or one of them shitheads from school I could look for. Any of yous heard my voice now, you'd think it was weather, or a bird screaming. You'd be sweating sand, like I'm the end of the world. Well, no need to worry. I don't forgive you, none of yous. But I'm over all that now. You're all in the past. My phone's flat anyway. Plugged into the dash, charging or dying, I don't know which. So, relax. I'm not calling. Everything's changed. I'm not what I was. All I am now is a fresh idea fanging north up the highway to where it's hot and safe and secret. I've got someone to collect. In Magnet. She'll be waiting and ready. At least, I hope so. 5th gear. Took me a few goes to find, but I'm there now. With red dirt flashing by, mulga scrub, glinty stones, roadkill crows. The Jeep reeks from all them slosh and jerry cans in the back, but the windows are open and the wind is warm and the stink of petrol beats the smell of blood any day. All of a sudden I'm hungry. I get the shotgun by the neck and heave it over on the back seat. I shove the box of shells away to get at the food, and it's still warm on the tin plate. It's good and greasy and tastes of smoke. From the first swallow, I get a hot charge. And I drive like that, with a chop in one hand and the wheel in the other, laughing hard enough to choke. For the first time in my life, I know what I want, and I have what it takes to get me there. If you never experienced that, I feel sorry for you. But it wasn't always like this. I've been through fire to get here. I've seen things and done things and had shit done to me you couldn't barely credit. So be happy for me. And for fuck's sake, don't get in my way. Thank you.
You described him as feral before you started reading that, so I'm going to start somewhere I didn't think I would. But there's a character in Breath, a previous novel of yours named Looney, who is described in that book as solitary and feral. I'd say it applies just as much to Jaxie, if not more. And I'm wondering if you think of him as the most alone character you've ever written in terms of his connections to the world.
I don't know if I do, but I mean it's interesting that those two characters are they're almost the same people in a sense. Boys who feel unmothered, their fathers are remote, finding their way, just full of reckless vigor, I suppose. But no, I'm not sure if. I think Jaxie's more conscious, and perhaps that's your point. Jaxie's more conscious than Looney. He is. He's kind of unlettered in a way. He's not really finished school. He's finished everybody at school, but he's cunning, but he's conscious. So I think, yeah, you're probably right to a degree. He is aware of that he doesn't fit, and that he is alone. He's a kind of an accidental existentialist.
Well, and his cousin Lee, who he's in love with, and who's the person he's going to see, and you made it sound like I didn't read the book. He is driving in that part that you read.
That's right.
Very soon after he's on foot.
Yeah, that's months before.
Promise the people, Tim. That and he, but he. Once his parents are gone, and Lee is this sort of, you don't know what Lee is. You assume that they have this very strong connection, but that could be, she exists, but the sort of the strength of that connection could be something he's relying on that might not happen when he gets there. And so he really is unanchored from any kind of, Looney at least had Brucey, and so you sort of send him out into this landscape all alone. And I read somewhere in an interview where you talked about the landscape coming first for you always, which is not hard to believe because you write about it so well, but I wonder is that literally true, where you sort of see that particular expanse of Australia before you know who Jaxie is or what his predicament is?
Yeah, I think that it is true, almost always. The ecosystem comes first, and that provides the terms of trade, if you like. The kinds of people who are going to be there, are subject to the logic of the place. And I've said this before, but it's, looking back, the way I've operated, I think, and it's not a conscious modus operandi, it's just how it seems to have happened. I see the place almost like a scene out of a bad Western, where the shimmering heat across the salt pan, depending on the budget, that goes on for a few seconds or a few minutes, and you think, well, we're somewhere, but what the hell? What gives? And then over time, there's a dot, and it slowly resolves itself into
Is it the hut?
as a cowboy, and he's got the saddle on his shoulder, and so there's a story already. What is that? It's the character comes out of the place, and I find them in the place, and where they've been, where they're going is kind of really very much related to that place and those the ecology, the terms of trade.
When you and I think many people here have probably read the book or are familiar enough. This is not a spoiler. There are things we definitely won't spoil because the ending is so powerful. But when you then see Jaxie at home, his father's under the car, and he has this newfound freedom's one way to look at it, but also kind of a problem on his hands. When you sort of see the characters and their very particular, quotidian dilemma, does that come as easily to you as that landscape that's shimmering, or do you feel like that's harder to sort of crystallize?
I think when I was younger, I found it harder to write about the indoors because you were always bumping into furniture, and there was this procedural stuff. You've got to get them from here to there. But I mean, honestly, that has to apply in the outdoor world because there's there's geography to contend with. But no, I think it's once I've got the place and the character emerges out of the place, then I'm, the process of writing the book is finding out who this person is, what's their story, what lies behind the surface. And to go back to the silly analogy of the salt pan and the cowboy, and why is he carrying his saddle? Because the horse is dead. Why is the horse dead? Because he's had improper relations, and with the horse, then the best way is to shoot the horse.
No witnesses.
Yeah. So that's what you see is one thing, but it's what's behind all the layers of heat shimmer. So it's writing a book is finding out about the people, and in a way going deeper into the place as well.
You said in another interview that when you were talking about writing the book from Jaxie's perspective, you talked about how unlettered he was, and that he's the voice in the novel. It doesn't switch perspectives. You said that writers need to take risks and to do stuff that is awkward. What was risky about Jaxie? What felt awkward about it to you? Did it feel particularly that way compared to earlier books?
I think it was actually quite difficult to write, partly because the language is so constrained and so grim and relentless and misogynistic. And he's a racist, and he's so you just pile that on. You live with someone like that and inhabit his mind and his dreams, and he's probably more troublingly his lexicon for a couple of years, and it sort of bends you out of shape a little bit. You're channeling someone that you're interested in, but a little bit appalled by, or a lot appalled by after a while. And I think the challenge for me was this kid, like most people, he's full of emotion, and he struggles to find a language for his very strong feelings and his aspirations as well. So it was this strange feeling of, and words are important to me and have been the saving of me as a person, and as the author, I have words I could give him. I could get him partly out of some of his dilemmas, not just by changing the plot, but just by giving him language that I have that would liberate him. Because I think one of the lovely things about language is it is a force and a means of liberation and change.
And he gets some of that, and the reader gets some of that through, once he meets Fintan, there's a bit of, you can see a little bit more of Jaxie through Fintan's eyes, and through Fintan's dialogue you get a little bit of things that Jaxie wouldn't be able to think of or say himself necessarily.
So some of the risk, I think, maybe I felt, some of the risk was just doing damage to myself, and some of it was just I was inhabiting this unpleasant little boy at a time when the unpleasantness of men is at the forefront culturally.
Yeah, you weren't putting down your pen and then going back to a world where everything's rosy.
No.
You said somewhere else, sometimes I really felt that this little scumbag's mercy.
Yeah.
That was a pithy way of putting it. But you've also talked about how you prefer, if we're going to speak in really broad terms, a kind of warmth in fiction and that feeling toward characters than more of a distanced, authorial, like they're under a microscope. So when a character like Jaxie presents himself to you, you must feel, there must be some sense of tenderness toward him, or feeling like he's capable of.
Yeah, it would be very hard to go the journey if I didn't have that sense of his vulnerability and his potential, and also just the fact that I lived in the country as a teenager. I had a very different family background to Jaxie, and I didn't experience violence on a daily basis in the way he does. But in many respects, it's so often writing the book and then thinking about it afterwards that I guess what kept me with him is that he could have he could have been me, I could have been him. Your life hangs on these little moments and hinges, and people are constrained by their circumstances,
And a lot of things he didn't ask for.
Yeah, that's
Especially
right.
his father's violence.
Yeah, being a scumbag is his way of surviving, being a victim, really, and also I guess I know kids like that, and that you see the way their life can turn and change and be liberated, not just by language, but often just by kindness.
They're very different books, this and Breath, but so I don't want to strain any comparisons. But one more thing did occur to me as I was rereading the new book, which is that Sando in Breath, who's this older surfer who kind of takes the two main characters under his wing, and Finton have this, whether they asked for it or not, they have a kind of mentor-like quality to these boys. And I wonder if there's anything for you in writing those relationships that's especially satisfying, where you have the kind of perspective of the older person who's lived through a lot of things, and then the younger person who, like you said, is very reckless and full of energy, but doesn't necessarily have the place to put it. Is that sort of conversation important to you?
Yeah, interesting. I guess I've written a lot about spoiled gurus or ruinous gurus or. But then every teacher is the teacher in their moment, and then every teacher knows that feeling of obsolescence when the student outpaces you or sees behind the curtain and sees that you're essentially faking it till you make it.
Right.
And every teacher just needs to stay one lesson ahead of the class. But eventually the cleverer kids catch up to you. And
right.
But yeah, I guess I've written about those relationships of people who are unmentored or yearning for some kind of guidance that don't get it at home, and it was, and in both cases you're right. They have things to teach these kids, but some things not to learn.
Yeah, their lives aren't exactly.
Yeah, they're not paragons by any means.
All hospital corners either.
No.
What about Finton's role? Not in the book, but just in his life as a priest. I actually, well, let's just talk about it now. I feel like this is maybe your most faith-interested novel, which is saying something because it's a theme in a lot of your work. But I feel like people who look for and enjoy religious imagery or subtext, there's a lot here to chew on. Was him being a priest a key part of that for you, and was that something you wanted to do in the book?
I'm not sure I can even honestly answer that honestly now, because I can't tell. In the first instance, I wanted Finton to be a priest just so I had an excuse for him to have language. You know, if you're going to go to the remote Western Australia, you've got to find an exceptional reason to give somebody language. Because particularly if it's a male, because there's not a lot of language available. Well, there's language and there's language, obviously.
You use a lot of both.
Yeah, and so both was deployed. So the idea that he was a priest meant that he had an education, and if you made him someone from a Celtic background, then language was available to that person, almost as a birthright and an assumption that it was okay to use. In fact, it was fun to use. So that there was that. But yes, in the end, once I realised that he was a priest, then there's this angry, fuming, fantasist, lover at 15 walking across the arid zone to his love, whether she knows it or not. In kind of existential turmoil, and here's this person who has a background, spoiled as he is. Yeah, it's a way of having two people bump up against each other, and like two dogs sniffing, but for them to press each other's buttons and ask questions that were essentially oblique, but really about the big things, even if they can't. So that was an interest. Yeah. So once I found myself in that mess, I just tried to get myself out as best I could. And also, it's a really odd time to be talking about these things with formal religion in complete disarray, truth and facts in disarray, science obviously being bested by strong feeling.
Yeah.
Shall we say?
Yeah.
So what a time to go trying to write a kind of a strange religious book.
Well, but they get at things obviously in I think very large philosophical ways that are in a lot of ways just as secular as religious, even though they're adjacent to each other. And they have one conversation back and forth between each other where they're talking about the difference between fighting versus surrender and murder versus sacrifice. And Finton is trying to teach him that sometimes they look one way and they're a different way. And Jaxie's very adamant about the fact, he says that he's crazy about that. And I wonder how much of that is, you seem like someone who searches for answers to big questions without necessarily thinking you're going to find them. And I wonder how much of that is your kind of own inner sense of those issues being played out on the page.
Yeah, I think, yeah, there's that. Well, we all have that kind of, searching, restless impulse. And some of it's a search for hope. And even if you're not a hopeful person, I think you realise that you have a kind of an obligation to not to manufacture hope, but to identify hope rather than to assume that it's not available, that it's not there. There's a kind of courage in that I guess as a younger man, even though I don't think I really understood Camus well when I was reading him as a student, just that the courage to go to face things down and to look for reasons not to despair,
Right.
even if on the face of it everything looked like it was cooked.
Circumstances aside, given how dire some of them are these days, do you consider yourself a hopeful person by nature?
No. I'm not an optimist. In that sense, I think sometimes it's a kind of a false question that we ask ourselves, because behind the question is an assumption of emotion. Optimism as a kind of a feeling, and hope as a feeling. I see it as a discipline, as a form of discipline. If there's anyone in the world that you love, whether you're a parent or a grandparent or not, if you've got friends, if there's anything in the world that you love, hope is required, and to manufacture or to change the conditions that you're faced with, so that hope's possible, so that hope's plausible. I mean, that's your responsibility. I even if I'm not emotionally feeling hopeful or optimistic, I feel like I have to take. I mean, maybe that's a religious thing. Maybe it's just an existential thing. I don't actually see any difference between the two. But the discipline of hope and optimism is, I guess it's another word for courage.
Well, on that word hope, while we're on it, I want to talk about the book's epigraph briefly, which is just a scrap of a poem by the writer Liam Rector, which says, "Change is slow and hope is violent." That's the entire epigraph. And I often think about the slowness of change, both in the world at large and also just in our own individual lives. But what about that second part, hope is violent? What does that mean to you in terms of the novel or just in general?
Again, I think when we hear the word violent, we always think of physical force. But when hope is alive, it breaks things. Hope, in order for things to get better, things need to get broken. Things need to be upended. Whether that's what's happening in our hearts, or what's happening in our polity, or what's happening in our family, in order to make things better, things need to be broken and remade. And obviously, in this instance, in this story, there's lots of physical violence. But almost the most damaging thing is the hope that's in this child's heart. Where he doesn't want to be a thug. He doesn't want to be a brute. He doesn't want to be a person that people are afraid of. He wants peace. He keeps talking about it all. I want peace. But what he puts himself through is violent. That because of his hope, because of his aspirations for something better.
I wish I had flagged it. I won't waste time looking for it. But there's a great line in the book where he says something like, I wanted peace, and I don't mean quiet neither. I mean peace.
Yeah.
It's a great. I thought that was very profound. So
I'm sure it wasn't.
Your parents both left school early to work, and yet I also know that you felt from a very young age a strong desire to write, in particular, and to communicate and to express yourself. So I'm wondering about your earliest exposures to culture, to reading, what that was like, where it came from, whether your parents, despite the schooling, were.
Yeah, look, my parents were both not untypical of their time in their generation in their class. I guess were thwarted. They got pulled out of school to work, and I think they just wanted for us. I have two brothers and a sister. They just wanted for us everything that they couldn't have, and this was at a time in history where you could actually work to create something better for your children, which seems to now be something we've left behind. But yeah, so books were always important. The greatest gift you could get in our family, at Christmas or a birthday, was a book. The best night of the week was the night we got driven to the public library, and so I guess there was that as the specialness of language, and then my parents became fundamentalist converts, and so we grew up with the King James Bible, and also this strange kind of working class coming together, people, not just sort of working out their own salvation, but working out their own education. They were like the similarities between being in a fundamentalist cult like what we were in, and being in an anarchist cell was quite profoundly. It was quite similar. I mean, it was. We were out for each other. We were onto each other, but we were bringing each other along, and there was that kind of. So it was it was my early exposure to socialism as well, even though everyone would have burnt a cross on my front lawn if I'd said anything like that when I was 10. But that kind of the rolling cadences of the King James Bible. So I think I've written somewhere, but when I went to high school and first heard Shakespeare, I didn't know what the hell he was on about, but I knew his sound right from the get-go. I mean, I knew that just that beautiful rolling.
Yeah.
It was just.
That's a jump on most of us.
Yeah.
I didn't know what the hell he was talking about, and I didn't know the sound.
Oh right,
Give me a minute.
It's like jazz. I don't know what they're doing. I don't know how they get those notes in, but I know that noise.
Do your parents love the language of the Bible? Do you remember other things that they liked reading, or?
Yeah, the Psalms in particular, and of course all the really ethical stuff. When I was a kid, was the most boring stuff. All the New Testament. We wanted the blood and thunder, from the Old Testament. But I know my parents particularly liked the Psalms. It was musical and the lyrical part.
My dad grew up Irish Catholic, and when we started going to church when I was a kid, and my mom, we went to a Protestant church, and he said, this isn't religion to me, these pancake breakfasts. I want someone to tell me that I'm bad and I'm going to hell. That's what I want when I go to church. You obviously grew up in and just, with a ton of exposure to this amazing landscape and living in nature. And did you feel, it might be hard to think back to that state of mind back then, but do you feel looking back that you understood nature in the way that a writer understands something before you understood people or social connections? I don't mean that to make you sound feral. I mean social connections.
No, I'm sure I was. Put it this way, I was very conscious at being a child of having a preference for the outdoors over the indoors, because in the outdoors you had agency. Mm-hmm. When you're a kid, you don't have that much power. Well, not in my childhood. And once you're outside, you could write the script in a way. And we only ever came home to get fed on dark anyway.
Maybe
but once you're inside, you're in the world of domesticity and obligation. But of course, the more you get to know the world of the outdoors, there are obligations and domesticities and rules and patterns anyway that you're subject to. So I guess you find out all your obligations and at different rates. But yeah, I think I felt. Yeah, probably the best way I can explain this. When I started to read the nature poets and I started to read the mystics as a 18, 19-year-old, the connection, finding words for it gave me words for what I had strong feelings. I'm making a mess of explaining this, but Those poets, gave me a language for the strong feelings I'd had since childhood. I felt that the world was alive, and even though at school the science was telling me that the world was just a machine, the older I got, the more I realised that the medieval organic view of the world was probably not just more realistic, but it was more scientific, as we've discovered since.
I just have a couple of processy questions for you. I know writers sometimes hate those, but I'm curious about two things in particular.
You're overestimating me if you think this is a process.
You do write...
Just making this shit up as I go along, mate.
Well, this is about the order in which you make that shit up.
Okay.
So you write at length and so beautifully about landscape in these ways. They're very immersive. And then you do have these... the dialogue's not always terse and snappy, but sometimes it is. And I wonder if you flow through those things while you're writing the way that we do while we're reading them, or is it I have to sit down and write about this bluff, and then later I have to sit down and write about this conversation between the two people over dinner?
Oh, look, I sort of charge through the best I can, breaking all the china on my way from one door to the next, and then I come back and try and tidy up and cover my tracks, I suppose. And of course, with dialogue, you're trying to get the most said without people talking to it. People are always talking across each other and away from each other, and that's where the dialogue is really. Not so much in the words that are said, but how they're missing each other, how they're misinterpreting each other, what they're leaving out.
There's a lot of that in this book.
Yeah. Well, there had to be.
Yeah.
In a way, but but most of the time I don't know what I'm doing.
Given given that you say that, and that I've heard you say it in entertaining different ways over the years, I imagine that you don't feel prolific to yourself. Other people would describe you that way, but do you feel like, for work of such high quality, I get these, I've done a lot? Or do you feel stymied?
No, I don't feel stymied. I feel lazy a lot of the time. But yeah, look, I'm an old person, and I look back because I've been doing it since I was a kid, almost literally. I think, well, I have done a few things, but it never felt prolific, because that sounds like a lot, doesn't it? But also, looking back, I wrote at that pace because I could, I suppose, because I was young and full of piss and vinegar. But I think I wrote at that pace because I was desperate, because I was trying to write literary prose for a living, which is just mental. And I had no other means of employment. And I had children early, so I was just charging away, and in a way that I couldn't possibly do now, because I just haven't got that vigour,
Right. You're more Fenton than Jaxie now.
Yeah, I guess there's a lot of ways I
Let
can
that
take
sink
that.
in, yeah.
But probably in more ways than I'd like to admit. It's odd. You're not that conscious of your own pace, and I was caught in the life. And honestly, I think I was just, even though I was terrified most of the time, I think I was enjoying the fact that I could. It's like riding a bike. You know you're going to fall over in any second, but the fact that you're not falling over, and obviously not falling over riding a bike has a lot to do with momentum. If you can keep going forward, you have half a chance of not falling off. The slower you go, that sort of headlong thing. Momentum's always been important to me. If we're going to talk process, getting going is the hardest part, and staying going.
Reminds me of when you talked about having agency in the outdoors, and it's kind of a different kind when you found it on the page. Maybe it was like, oh, this is a giant area for me to run around in and expend some energy, and this is fun.
Yeah, I didn't know. I hadn't travelled much. I didn't know much, but I guess I loved where I was, and the more you scratch, the more you find.
I want to talk about activism for a few minutes before we take questions from the audience. I'm squinting because the clock is in the dark back there. But you have spoken about your activism and your creative anarchy, or not process, but whatever you want to call it, as very separate, entities in your life. And I'm reminded of an American writer I admire named David James Duncan, who is writes a lot about sort of spirituality in general. He is from the Pacific Northwest of America and very invested in the land up there, and he's also an activist. And I don't know him, and so I can't say that this is why, but it's, his last novel was published almost 30 years ago, I think, and I wonder, as you get older and as things seem, I don't think many people will disagree, more and more dire in a lot of ways, whether you feel a need to pay more attention to that balance, and whether this place that you so love feels like it has an even stronger grip on your time and mental energy these days.
Yeah, look, I think that's fair. I think, look, I come from this, Protestant background of and this kind of unlettered background. So there was always a lot of psychological pressure, knowing that I was essentially embarking on a life of useless labour, and and art is supreme uselessness, and it doesn't need an excuse to exist. And it took me a long time as an adult to own the fact that I was doing something that, not that it doesn't matter, but it just that it doesn't change things. It doesn't cure anything. It doesn't. And coming from my background, it took a lot of owning the fact that, okay, I'm going to do something that's about beauty, and there's a utility in beauty, but it's not quite the same thing. Yeah. And then to own that all your life, but then and to think, well, okay, I don't. The artist doesn't have to. All the artist has to do is to do good work. They don't need any other excuse. Yeah. But I suppose as I've been conscious, particularly as someone, as you say, who's dependent on landscape for inspiration, for charging up my spirit, just realising that we're in a world of trouble, and the landscapes that I'm writing about, the places that I depend on, that I love as family, and that's something I have learnt in my lifetime, to not just admire a place or not appreciate a place, but to have a familial relationship with it, of obligation. These places are in such trouble that I have to fight for them, and if that means taking time off being an artist and being a rabble-rouser instead, to fight for those places for the people who are not yet with us, then so be it. I also have, let's be honest, I have the luxury to do it because I'm not fighting to keep the wolf from the door in the way that I was in my 20s, for instance. But I think a lot of us, whatever our position, I think a lot of people who are in the arts space, who are arts workers, just feel more and more, culturally, geographically, biologically, ecologically bound up, caught up. We are. There's not much chance of sidestepping this one. This is not. This is the point we are in history has taken us to the brink where we can. You can struggle to see a viable future for the children of your grandchildren, and so that makes me think about not just have I lived a good life, but am I going to be a good ancestor? Am I a good ancestor? And I think that's a question that we all have to ask ourselves.
That's well said, and I do think there's a lot of beauty in art, and I love your rabble-rousing. I'm all for it, but I do think I would say that that I think that art doesn't always, and it doesn't have to. It has no, that it can do some of that breaking up of things inside that you talked about in terms of hope. And I don't doubt that your writing has changed a lot of people's views of the natural world and their place in it and what they want to do for it. So we have about 15 minutes left, I think. So I imagine we have a lot of questions in the audience. So we have I was told we have 4 microphones.
You don't have to, by the way. It's not school or
No, we're going to have one question from everyone before we leave today. So get
Process.
ready.
What's that?
Right behind you up there in the very back. Don't be shy.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I appreciated that talk. It was very good. You have an ability to make the reader feel like he's in the book, and I particularly found that with Breathe. My first ever surfing experience as a Scotsman was at Margaret River, and it was quite terrifying. Are you a surfer yourself? Did you learn at Cottesloe or something?
Yes, I started surfing in 1965. And you think I'd get better by over the years, but yeah, surfing for me has always just been an enormous outlet. But also, it's just there's a corollary there. I think I've learnt over time that surfing and writing they're not they're not always seen as a natural match.
Paper
The
gets
thing
wet.
that they have in common as a writer and a surfer, there's a lot of waiting involved, and a wave, for a surfer, you're waiting for a swell, and a swell is just the residue of an event across the horizon that's long past, and these events that have happened across the horizon radiate outwards, and as a surfer, you crave them, you wait for them, you turn around, you try. When they do arrive, you turn around and try and match their speed, catch up with them, and ride their energy to the shore. And as a novelist or a short story writer, that's kind of what I do. I mean, I show up at the desk and bob around, waiting, and hope that something comes across the event horizon. And essentially, stories and ideas and memories, it just ripples from old events.
Taking it out of metaphor, how often do you get out these days? Because when you were around 50, I saw you said you'd take another 10 to 15 years of surfing, and it's a few years later.
Yeah, I'm still going 5 days a week.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah. But it comes down to how good the old back is in the end.
Anybody else? Up here in the third row.
Hi there.
Hello.
Oh, God. That's loud, is it?
That's all right.
Where are we?
Ozzy Osbourne's louder.
Next, over here. Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh.
What, after me, you mean?
I have no idea where we are. Raise your hand. Yes.
I'm
there we
here.
go.
Oh,
Thank you.
there you go. Good
Lights
on you.
are quite bright. Hello.
Flower on.
Sorry, no, it's just a quick comment, but would you consider yourself to be quite a spiritual person then? Because it seems to me you're saying things just come out. It's not as if you're planning it. It's more like you're waiting for inspiration and for things to evolve and come from somewhere within you rather than...
Yeah, look, that's kind of how it is. I don't know if that really means I qualify as a particularly spiritual person, but I'm doing this for money.
Well,
But
yeah.
but yeah, I think most people who are in this caper, you have to wait. I mean, there's all the planning in the world you can do, but things turn up in their own time, and you need to respect the time that it takes for things to show up. And look, I'm not channeling anything. I'm just grasping after bits and pieces that are out there,
But it's
in
like it's
the
almost
culture.
waiting to be written and you're just...
Or stolen, because it's just we're like magpies. We just pick
I like
things
it.
up.
It's really beautiful,
Oh,
though, the way
thank
you
you.
describe it. So, yeah.
Oh, thanks.
I'll go over here now.
Yeah, I just wonder where you write, because you do write very well about the outdoors. I mean, do you ever make notes in the outdoors, or is it that you sit down at a desk and just draw from your inspiration of being outside?
No, I don't really take any notes, and I wouldn't do it outside because work's for inside, fun's for outside, and also to work outside where I live, you'd be burnt to a crisp in 10 minutes. I live on the edge of the desert, so. But honestly, I've lived most of my life, indoors, outdoors. The two things are together. It's like the physical world and the life of the mind, and I can't easily separate them. So it's no big thing for me to be indoors. I carry all the things, in the same way that whatever I did this morning in the big gnarly world, I can maybe some of that'll show up in the day's work, but things I did as a 3-year-old or a 7-year-old, they're still with me as well. You're dragging along all this baggage, like a comet or a dumpster fire. I don't know.
Anybody else?
Hi, I just wanted to say that I'm retired now, but I work with kind of very challenging young people, and even though I'm retired now, I'm always find it so heartrending, those troubled young people who've lost their way and they're so angry and all the rest of it, and how wonderful it was to take them outdoors and how they absolutely seem to come alive and love that, being out in the wilds and that kind of thing. Where did you kind of experience that you were able to bring that into your books?
I don't know. I think I think it's just from childhood. I think when you're a child, and then of course when you're an adolescent, you're just full of turmoil. Even if you're as well loved and nurtured as I was as a young person, you're always coming up against things that is incomprehensible. It's like, why is it like this? And you get caught up in this kind of knots of rage. And I just felt that in the natural world I could be purged. I mean, I think the desert and the forest and the ocean, they're similar. I mean, the ocean in particular was very important to me as an adolescent, because it was like a big salty poultice that would suck the poison out of me. And and I'm still similar. I mean, anyone in my family knows that I'm an easier prospect to deal with after I've been in the water than I am before I've been in the water. But yeah, it is hard to see these younger people, who are boiling with trouble, because these damaged people go on and do damage, and I think I guess I was just grateful that I managed to find ways out of it, and two things. I guess I found a language to express myself in, and then the outdoors gave me a second language in which to express myself. And those are two things that, as you'll know from your work, finding languages to give to younger people to liberate them, and it's hard. It's not always easy to find the right language.
Over here on the left. Oh, we'll get to you next.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I think perhaps I feel a little bit like the last lady. It was interesting you saying that it was challenging for you to be with that character because he's so unpleasant, because I find him intensely lovable. I think, as you said, he does have a conscience, he does have a discipline, and he has empathy, and to my mind, quite strong. He does have morals that almost to the point where that for me, I sort of struggled to believe in that, because he has such a horrible childhood to have the sort of luxury of such a generous empathy for other people. Maybe I'm too cynical, but I thought I would have accepted him being a bit more horrible.
Oh, that's a note to self. Go harder, Tim, go harder. But honestly, would you have picked him up if he was hitching along the road? You wouldn't have picked him up. You wouldn't have him in your house. I'm not going to have him in my house. Perhaps I know more about him than you, but there's probably more of me in him than you. No, it's interesting though. I think, yes, I think he is. I think he is a sociopath, and he is a deeply moral person. He's trying to. He's got two sides of him that he's trying to figure out. But you forget that he does murder his way across the landscape. He's killing anything that moves. He needs to.
To eat.
Yeah.
We have someone over there where you're nailing, and then we'll go one up, and then that might be it. We'll see how timing goes. Oh, I'm sorry, that gentleman. I thought you had someone where you were.
Hi. Do you dream about the characters in your books? And if the answer is yes, about the characters in the book you're writing, and or do you dream about characters in books you've written years ago? And do they come back to haunt you? I mean, do they appear like old friends?
It's a very nice way of putting it.
Are you insane? Short version.
Well, I think yes. I have dreams about characters I wrote about years ago, as you said. And the only way I can explain that, it's probably an argument of convenience, but the only way I can explain it is that making people come to life and keeping them alive for 200 pages or 400 pages or 2 years or 4 years or 7 years, however long the book takes to generate and finish, it's quite intense as an experience. And if it's any good for the reader, what you're trying to give to the reader is as close to a genuine, authentic experience as possible. So it has to be very intense for yourself as a writer. So yeah, I often, well, not often, but I occasionally wake up very upset from a dream where somebody close to me has had something terrible happen to them, and then I realise, before I've even put my feet on the floor, that I've just had a dream about somebody who doesn't even exist, who I've made up. But obviously, I'd had such an intense work experience with this person where it was as good as an experience, and so you get an afterburn from that, and I'd hope that doesn't get too intense, because I've got to look after my mental health.
I'll ask you one last question. I told them we'd finish right on time, which is just about now. But as movies are made of your books, since you dream about them and you see them so clearly, you're involved with the movies. But do you ever think to yourself, "Boy, he looks different than I thought he would"?
Oh, almost always. I mean, any kind of adaptation, everything is different. When you give your work over to be adapted, you're doing it knowingly that someone else is going to interpret that, and it's going to be completely different. Having said that, sometimes I've been to a play or seen a film, and the person who's played a character is then thereafter forever that person in your mind. So you're as manipulable as anybody.
I'll just say, on a practical note before we finish, Tim's going to be signing books in the Signing Hut, which is near a big sign that says Gin, so that's how I remember it. And he'll be there in just a few minutes. I'm going to spirit him away quickly, but you can talk to him there and have him sign books. I can't properly describe what an honor this was for me, so I just want to thank Tim Winton and all of you for being such a great audience. So please thank Tim.
Thank you.
All right, done?